But one of a strange tradition that a lot of people do around Christmas time, if they get together with friends or co-workers, are the exchanging of white elephant gifts. Right? You guys have all been to a white elephant gift party where people bring things they don't need anymore. It's not supposed to be junk, but it's supposed to be something I don't need or I'm not using, and usually those gifts can be stolen in this white elephant gift exchange, and who knows what you'll come home with. Our life group that meets, we have a Christmas party every year, and there has been this giant wooden duck that's been making the rounds. It's actually a nutcracker. Its head comes up and smashes the nuts. It's pretty, about this big, solid hunk of wood. It's been living in our house. Well, it's been in our possession the last year. My wife hates it, so it spends most of the year in my office, on my desk. And my children love it, and they didn't name it. I think it was Riley Moore who named it. Its name is now Quackers, and they'll be like, "Can Quackers come visit us?" And so Quackers will get to have, a sleepover, hang out in their room for a couple of days, and he'll come back to my office. But he'll be someone else's ornament next year, because he'll be back in the white elephant gift exchange. I've gotten other stuff too. I remember when I used to do this with our youth group, there was this porcelain cat that was making the rounds, until one person got it and declared they wanted it, and it never returned. And so it became theirs. I have a mosquito zapper, a bug zapper, that I still have that bug zapper, picked up at a white elephant gift. You can get some really unusual things. Well, today we're going to be talking a little bit, it does kind of relate, about Mary and Joseph getting some unusual gifts for baby Jesus. Actually, baby Jesus is getting the gifts. They're probably put in Mary and Joseph's care, because they have strange gifts from strange visitors. And we're going to go on the Christmas sermon that is actually after Christmas. It was when the wise men showed up. And they came to worship Jesus Christ. We read in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. We'll look at these again. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." And it's something that we're very familiar with. These image of the wise men. They came to bring Jesus gifts because they had seen his star. So we're going to look at some different elements of this morning, because really we're going to look at three magi. We don't know if there were three magi, by the way, but it works well numerically. We know there are three gifts. It doesn't say how many magi. Could have been half a dozen. Could have been more. But they came bearing three different gifts. So it's three magi and two kings, because they're both mentioned here. We have the King of Kings, and we also have King Herod, who is also a key component of this story. And one crown, because really there's only one ruler. And so we're going to take some time to go through this morning and see what God has to say to us. So please pray with me again, and let's just ask God to bless the scripture this morning. Lord, we do pray this morning that you would speak through your word and show us what you would have us to take from this message. I pray that my remarks will be appropriate and used by you, but that we would have a greater appreciation for who you are and what you have done for us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're going to back up a little bit before we read this passage here, because in the time when Jesus was born, there had been 400 years of silence. We've talked about this on our Christmas sermons. You have the closing of the Old Testament, which was with the book of Malachi, and then it's silence until the angel appears to Zechariah and says, "You're going to have a son, John." And so what had been going on in the meantime? Why is it that Israel is so looking forward toward a consolation, looking for a Messiah, looking for a king? What has been going on in history? What's been going on in the world? Well, quite a bit has happened. If you understand what happened in the Old Testament, God chose the Jewish people. He gave them a country. He made them promises that if you were faithful, you would have these blessings. And then, because they were disobedient, just like he had predicted in the book of Deuteronomy, they were taken off to a foreign land. First, the northern kingdom was taken off by the Assyrians into captivity, into numerous places. And that purple line on the map demonstrates where they were taken. And then on the lower one in green, the Babylonians later conquered Judah. ultimately completely conquering it in 586, 587. And so they were carried off into captivity. And there's a series of deportations. The first one starting in 604, 605. Those dates do matter, but not really for our sermon. But they started deporting the Jewish people. And what's really notable about that is from the date when Jerusalem was destroyed, the Jewish people no longer had their own country. It doesn't mean that their land was no longer theirs. It doesn't mean that because under King Cyrus they were allowed to return. So roughly 70 years later from the first deportation, was 7 years of captivity. It is 70 years actually. They get to start coming back. And coming back to their ancestral land. But there's a big difference. They are no longer the rulers of their own country. At the very best, they have client governors, maybe some local people, but usually they're under the direct thumb of foreign rulers. And if you study the book of Daniel, Daniel actually told us ahead of time. It's really interesting. God revealed to Daniel to tell history before it happened. We call that prophecy. But from God's point of view, who sees all things past, present, and future, this is no surprise. And he told them this vision of 4 animals. I know that looks like a great Christmas picture. He told them these 4 successive kingdoms are going to rule over the Jewish people. And we started off with the lion. And the lion being symbolic for Babylon. And Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, the one who had conquered the Jewish people and taken them into captivity. And then later on we have the Medes and the Persians, which we know as Persia, the Persian Empire. And they were ruling over the entire region, including the Jewish people and all of their land. And Persia encompasses all of the Jewish people who had been taken into captivity, incidentally, because they ruled over all of those lands. So when Cyrus gives the decree, you can go home, all of the Jewish people, now under the province of Persia, can go back to their homeland. They are no longer held away. Well, the Persians held sway in that part of the world, the most powerful empire for a long period of time, until a man that we know from history by the name of Alexander the Great rises up. And we have the 4-headed leopard. Comes onto the scene, and with swiftness conquers Persia. And now we have the Greek Empire. And it's very short-lived in the regard that Alexander did not live long. But when he was died with the 4 heads, it was divided up, and you can check this in history, to his 4 generals. They didn't keep the empire together. It was divided into 4 smaller empires. And then there's another, we could go more into Daniel and talk about the sheep and the goat and the ram and all of that, those kind of things. Because the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, I just butchered that name again, but what happened is, for a time, the Ptolemies, think Egypt, king of the south, they're ruling over the land of Israel. This is very important to the Jewish people, these prophecies. And then after a time period, came in the king of the north, who you may have heard of, Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes, he's of the Seleucids, and comes down, and he's now in charge, because they're battling back and forth for borders, and now they're in charge of the land of Israel. Very important things if you're Jewish, and this is your land promised by God. Well, in the middle of all this thing, all of this happens, a group of Jewish people rise up against Antiochus Epiphanes because he was trying to basically wipe out Judaism and say you need to worship the gods that we worship, Greek gods. And the group of people called the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, rise up and say, no, we will not do this. And for a limited period of time, they get to be their own kingdom. Again, just a little blip on the radar. It's not totally by their own lead, because part of the reason this happened is there's this rising empire on the other side of the Mediterranean they appealed to, and there's some mutual benefit society. Actually, some of the Jewish people helped a man that you may know by the name of Julius Caesar. Prior to that, some of the Romans helped the Maccabees, and they have their own state. And it becomes the Hasmonean kingdom. And they have kings that very quickly stop being faithful to God. Pretty soon, that whole power corrupts, and they're pretty soon doing all the same things that they were just in rebellion against. And Rome begins to hold sway. Well, the last of the Hasmonean kings comes up, and well, not the last, but Alexander and his wife come up. They are Alexander and Salome, have 2 sons, and when they both die, they get in a civil war. These men by the names of Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Now, the Hyrcanus is not a very strong man, but there's a person in his court who likes intrigue. He's very ambitious. His name is Antipater. He weasels his way in and says, you need to fight for this throne. The reason he wants him to fight for the throne, he wants a ruler he can control and promote his own family's fortune. Well, after a civil war, what do? And this is a big problem going into the Old Testament, is eventually to settle the dispute between the two brothers, they appeal to Rome. So you decide who should be king. Rome chooses Hyrcanus, and after that time they have their fingers very much in the land of Israel, and it's going to be a very short period of time before they are not independent at all. It goes from, hey, why don't you help us out a little bit and we'll help you, to how about you'll be our advisors, to how about you will be our overlords, and this happens in rapid succession. By that time period, it came to pass after Hyrcanus, the man who seized the throne was a man by the name of Herod, who had formerly been the governor, who is not Jewish. He is an Idumean. If you know the Old Testament, that would be an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. You're like, okay, this is too much history, Troy. Suffice it to say, here's a man when the Jewish people had their country back, they told the descendants of Esau, you'll either convert to Judaism as a religion, or you have to leave the country. So a lot of people converted. Not necessarily had a heart conversion, but they had a conversion outwardly. Herod is now ruling, and Herod is not a good guy. So if you heard nothing else now, you can re-engage. Herod is not a good guy. In fact, if you looked it up, I read this, Herod the Great, that's what he is called. He has been described as a madman who murdered his own family and a great many rabbis. The evil genius of the Judean nation, prepared to commit any crime in order to gratify his unbounded ambition, and the greatest builder in Jewish history. The reason I have this picture up here, this is a Herodian, it is just outside of Bethlehem. This is one of Herod's palaces. It may not look like much. You say, that's a pretty flat-looking hill. But what I want you to understand is this hill is a man-made hill. It was a small rise, and he built a hill to have a palace. And it's one of his notable palaces. And so you can see from the aerial view looking down, it's a palace fortress because he knew he had a great many enemies. And he liked to go off and live lavishly. On the coast of Caesarea, he had a huge ego. He built Caesarea where there was no port. He made a huge port. They dumped the stone and the concrete and made an artificial port so that he could house and for trade Roman merchant vessels. He was a notable king and a great builder, but he was an evil man. And this is the man who was ruling over the country at the time of Jesus. The country at this time is in the white. And Herod is king there by Rome's permission. That's the best way to describe it. But he is king. Not a Jewish king, but called a Jewish king. Called the king of the Jews. Herod had a lot of intrigue. I said his father Antipater was a man of politics, a man of ambition. Well, Herod even more so. And in fact, he had a bad habit of killing off people who had any claim to the throne. He killed off his wife for conspiring against him. He killed off his brother-in-law for conspiring against him. He killed off 3 of his sons for conspiring against him. In fact, one of the Romans of the time said it is safer to be a dog in Herod's house than one of his sons. He was a man who was ambitious. A man who was not the rightful king, but was the ruling king. And it's this background that we're going to read here in Matthew chapter 2. And in verse 1 and following. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. When Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what the time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." When they heard the king, they departed. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they opened up their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. So here's what we see. We see that there is a king, but he's not the king. And in fact, these wise men see a message in the stars that something is going on. And so they journey to make worship of this king. You would say, who are these wise men? What's going on? Where are they from? What's the Star of Proclamation? Now, suffice it to say, there's a lot of theories about what the Star of Bethlehem is and end times. One of the ones that I think is a very excellent resource you can check out is called the Star of Bethlehem. It's one of the proposed ideas. I think it's one of the best academic searches of it, and it really ties together nicely and explains this. It's called, so you look up the starbethlehem.com or net or whatever. You can also pick up the video at Lifeway or any Christian bookstore or Amazon. But we know that these people are in the East and they are magi, from which we get the word magician. But they're not like magicians, like circus magician, or magicians like evil wizards or anything like that. But at that time period, some of them would go into all sorts of astrology and paganism, and other ones were just learned sages. They were the educated people of the day. They were required to know about astronomy. They were called to know about botany, about health, about physics, about histories, about prophecies. They were the advisors to the king, and they'd have a whole school of them around. Kings would have these mages in the east, from where the Persian Empire was, and they were the learned men of the day. And be a interesting idea for conjecture to think this could be the same school of people that Daniel would have been a part of. He could have been one of the Magi, which, who knows, we're just speculating here, why they might have been interested in Jewish prophecies, because who was preeminent among the wise men of that day but Daniel, who they say would have the very words of God and foretold the future before it happened. And we have his book in the Bible because obviously a devout follower of God and a prophet of God. But as they're looking, they see something in the sky, which according to my best guess could be the conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter, which were both considered stars by their ancient reckoning. But whether it was something that or something different, they see something up there that causes them to realize there's a king being born, a great king, a king greater than any king we have ever seen, and is associated with the Jewish people. And it was something so notable that they saw that they decided to make the trip. So they themselves go from their centers of learning, which says in the east, doesn't mean it's in Babylon or wherever in Persia they're at. But they make their journey east, and they arrive in Jerusalem, and they want to know where this king is, who has been born. And so they go to the ruling king. Say, we've seen a sign that a great king has been born, which is a very troubling thing. And the reason we had the extended biography of Herod is to get the picture. Here's an ambitious man, a cruel man, a man who is reigning over the Jews as they've been reigned over since the time of their banishment, of their exile. And he asked, and says, Jerusalem is troubled with him. Of course Jerusalem is troubled. Because if there's another king, that means there's going to be bloodshed. And you can see they look through the scripture, and they know that in Bethlehem is where the king is to be born. And Herod brings him aside, and obviously he's lying to them. He says, "Will you find this king? I am only a servant." You can just imagine what his exact words were. I am just a client king holding this throne until the king we've all been waiting for appears. Let me know too that I may worship the true king. Well, Herod's idea of worship sounds a lot like murder, but the Magi don't know that. And so they go off to Bethlehem. And it says a star going ahead of them, and they find Mary and Joseph. and Jesus. We didn't read about Joseph yet, where he's warned in a dream and just a verse later, so we know he's there as well. They've now moved in the house. They're not in the stable. I'm really sorry that the wise men don't belong in your stable for your nativity sets. You can leave them there. They're part of the story. But they see him, and it says in the house, they see the child. They see Jesus. And they worship him. And they bring these gifts of gold, of frankincense, and myrrh. And these are notable gifts. One, because they're very valuable. Remember how we talked last week? We said Joseph and Mary were poor. They gave a poor person's offering at the temple. And now they're being given gifts of real tangible value. You could sell these and live off them for some time. And they're going to need to, incidentally. We're going to see this in just a few more verses. But gold, we associate that with kings. Do we not? When we see kings, they have a crown of gold. They may have a throne of gold. They have a golden scepter. They collect gold. Kings are associated with gold, and yet there's a secondary reference for that gold as well, because the temple of the Lord, the Holy of Holies, was laid with gold. And so we can talk about his kingly authority and his power and majesty, but it also is going to say that it's the sanctuary of where God dwelt among his people, because it was in the temple that Holy of Holies was lined with gold, and there was a golden ark which his presence was manifest upon. But now it's Jesus Christ, who is God manifest in human form to all his people. And so it's duly notable. Now, I don't know that the Magi understood this, and Matthew doesn't point out and say, hey, this is what it symbolically means. However, we can see it just oozing onto the pages of who Jesus Christ is, because the second gift is the incense, which is a priestly fragrance that they would use in their offerings. Remember, they have the incense inside of the temple that they would burn before the Lord. And this is one of the incenses that would be burned. And we know that Jesus Christ himself was our priest. He is the one who would be to satisfy all of the wrath. He's the one once for all. We could read the book of Hebrews. And just another foreshadowing of the ministry that Jesus Christ would have. And then myrrh. Myrrh, which is a burial fragrance. It's used in other fragrances as well, but it was used to embalm bodies. A very valuable fragrance. And as we look ahead and we know this child that they were visiting, it would be his death that would bring us peace with God. And he would be embalmed again. In not too many years. Not because he had fallen plot of worldly rulers, but because he had willingly laid down his life for you and for me. And we see at that time that God, in his infinite wisdom and plan, had even orchestrated that even the gifts that the wise men brought, whether it was in total ignorance or not, would point to who he was and is and what he would do. Well, King Herod has no designs to worship this king. He wants to do to this king what he has done for every other. And we read in verse 12 that the wise men, being divinely warned in a dream, departed to their own country another way. Kind of snuck off in the night. They had worshipped the king. They had seen the king with their own eyes. Probably touched him with their own hands. And then they left. And in verse 13, we see that God warns the family as well. It says, now when they had departed, being the Magi, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. And we see here that Jesus Christ is the servant of Israel. And he is a picture of Israel. And you see him replaying, and all the scriptures pointing to who Jesus is. the Exodus journey. He now goes to Israel, just as his forefathers had gone to Israel. And you remember the story in the Old Testament, how Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery, went down into Israel, and then through the famine, he provided a place for his family to find safety. And not just safety with physical needs, but also that through the time and the wickedness of the Amorites, so they might not be corrupted and intermarry with all these pagans in the land until the data had become complete and those people were deserving of judgment, that God brought them back into the land that became Israel. Well, now Jesus himself, for his protection, is going down into Egypt, until Herod, which will be a short time period, dies and they can come safely back. And not wanting to be anywhere near Jerusalem, they go back to where they started, in Nazareth. Because Herod is a vengeful king. And if we went a few more verses, you get a picture of what kind of a man he was. That it says, in Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise man, was exceedingly angry. And he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its districts, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Now, some people have tried to say, well, there's no record of this, of Herod killing these people. Well, there's a lot of records of Herod killing a lot of people, so it can easily get lost in the shuffle. But even historians who have not held the Bible in high regard have also added, there's no record of this happening in the histories, but it is not out of character. This is very normal. In fact, Herod, when he was going to die, he knew he was dying. Got the leading men from every village in Judea and brought them down to the Colosseum and had them locked up. So they'd go to your town, they'd go to your community and say, who's your civic leaders? Who are people who are well-loved, who are influential? And he had them rounded up and put in the Colosseum. And he said, I know no one will cry for me when I die, but there will be rejoicing. So I give an order that when I die, you kill all of these men too, so that there will be crying in Israel when I die. Thankfully, the soldiers did not carry that out. But this is the type of man that Herod was. And so it is definitely worth believing that Scripture is indeed true. And we see these tales of these two kings, Herod and Jesus. And I love this picture here that somebody had painted, because you see a stable in the artist's mind of what it would look like. And in the distance you see that artificial hill, the Herodian, the palace of Herod. And it towers over Bethlehem in the distance. You can see it from miles away. And you can picture of one king, an earthly king, a wicked king, living in majesty by worldly standards, living and ruling. But the King of Kings, born in a stable and humility. And there cannot be a bigger contrast. Because here was Herod on the one hand, who would cling to a crown at any cost. I've already told you how he killed his family. When his sons conspired against him, he would kill them so that he could keep the throne for as long as he drew breath. No matter the atrocity, he would do it. But what about Jesus Christ? What about the King of Kings? We know that he, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And I hope by looking at who Herod was, it gives such a contrast to an earthly king of who Jesus is. Here is the Prince of Heaven, the creator of the universe, that said, I will be born a helpless babe to a couple peasants, born in the stable, rejected, despised, lowly, and humble. We know in Corinthians, and the context is a little bit off, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it talks about athletes, and it says, everyone who competes for the prize, they do it to obtain a perishable crown. And Herod and all the others and people today put so much effort and energy into trying to obtain things and keep things and gain things and gain esteem and privilege and status. But Jesus Christ himself said there's something that's worth more than that which is mine by right. And he who said, I am humble and lowly in spirit, was willing to become the servant of all. It's a beautiful picture of who Jesus is. We know, of course, Mark 10, verse 45, that says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And there can't be a bigger contrast between the worldly systems, and we've just talked briefly about empires, people who would rise up and were bent on conquest for their own name's sake, to the king who would set aside what was rightfully his so that we might not perish. And that is the king that was recognized by the wise men with gold and frankincense and notably myrrh. He's our Savior. We do know, is if we would look more at Micah 5:2, that prophecy about him being born in Bethlehem does indeed tell us more about his foundations, that he's from ancient times, that you could read from eternity, being that he is indeed God. And the verse itself could give us a context of that. And we know from Isaiah 9:6, he said he will be called Everlasting Father. Daniel calls him the Son of Man in heaven, receiving the kingship from the Ancient of Days, that he who was sent into the world is the supreme. And yet he is the greatest servant of all. Well, we do know that the King we serve is also coming again. It's a beautiful, beautiful hope that we have, the knowledge in Scripture of that Jesus Christ did not just come once, but he is indeed coming again. And we look forward to that. When we celebrate Advent, and we left these candles up here this morning, and it's appropriate because we call Christ coming when we remember at Christmas time his first Advent, his first appearing, his first visitation. But we look forward to that day, which is our consolation and our hope, when he will indeed return. And we know that as Jesus Christ in the clouds after his resurrection, and his disciples around him, they stood around wondering what to do, that the angels came and told them that he would return in the same manner which he had gone. And we read about how when he will come back down and put his feet on the Mount of Olives, and he will reign and be ruler over all things. That we know that we can look forward to this. And at that time he will indeed rule as king and subdue all kingdoms and do away with sinful rebellion of our worldly system. And will rule in righteousness. We read in 1 Timothy verses 14 through 16 of chapter 6. And these are Paul's words here. He says, until our Lord Jesus Christ is appearing. And he's looking to him coming back. He will manifest in his own time. He who is the only blessed and only potentate, that's just kind of an unusual word, isn't it? This thing, sovereign, ruler, emperor. The King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, dwelling in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen or can see, to whom be honor and everlasting power. Amen. So as we are wrapping up this Christmas season, and we celebrate Christ's first coming, we celebrate his birth, let us also look with expectation that Jesus Christ is coming again. Now, for those of us who pass before he goes, there is great consolation and hope in Scripture. We know that those who are absent in the body are present with the Lord already, and we can rejoice in that. There's a great, great joy when somebody who trusts in the Lord as their Savior passes from this earth and the suffering and the death and the disease and the hardship. It's not joy for us, because of course we mourn and we miss them, and it's hard. And we all know that because we've shed tears. Sometimes great, great sorrow at the passing of loved ones. But when it is somebody who knows the Lord, there's a great comfort there. To know that it is not goodbye, but it's just, we'll see you later. And that they are okay. It's we who are still suffering. And so there is a joy for those who have passed before Jesus Christ has come back. But we also know that he is indeed coming. And this world will not be allowed to run on a sinful, broken course forever. But that he will come as a righteous king and the holy judge and put the world in order and vanquish his enemies. He is returning. When I noticed at the very beginning, it says, in his own time. We know from the second epistle of Peter that God's time is not like our time. He does things at the appropriate time and not too soon and never too late. But Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And He's a King who is willing to set aside His life to offer us life. Wise men recognized the significance of His birth. They saw the royalty of His position, and their gifts foreshadowed the enormity of His sacrifice. And they even listened to the voice of God's guidance as they departed their own way. So I pray that we would be wise. I pray that we would recognize His King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And that we would receive His gift. A gift of salvation and life. A gift of peace with God. And know that He is a Lord worth following. For He is loving and kind. And He's worth giving our whole lives to, because He is salvation. And He is the only true King. And He is the only one with rights to the crown. And by His grace and His mercy, because of His first coming, we can be His people. Children of the Almighty King, God Himself. Let's pray. God, we can't begin to understand the depths of your love. Well, I guess we can begin, but we can never completely fathom. But I pray you would give us an appreciation for your sacrifice. When we think of the cross, often, but we don't perhaps fully appreciate what you're willing to leave, what you're willing to endure, and the humiliation that you bore for us. God, please continue to overwhelm us with your love and give us hearts that are faithful and true, that we may be faithful servants and act as true children. We love you, Lord. Say the same in Jesus' name. Amen.